How did a young woman from Shreveport become the only woman ever sent to Louisiana's electric chair? What could lead someone from the gritty streets of the city to an act so shocking that it would haunt the state's history for decades? This is the story of Toni Jo Henry, a tale of fierce love, desperation, and a fateful promise that changed everything. Today, we're diving into the events that led her down this dark path and the single decision that sealed her fate. Toni Jo Henry's life began in Shreveport, Louisiana in 1916 under the name Annie Beatrice McQuiston, but the little girl who would later be known as Toni Jo was dealt a harsh hand from the start. Growing up in a struggling family, she faced unimaginable losses, including the death of her mother when she was just 6 years old. Sent to live with her father and stepmother, Toni Jo found herself in a world that demanded survival at any cost. By 13, she was forced to leave school to help support her family, taking a job at a local macaroni factory. However, when rumors of her mother's tuberculosis spread, Toni Jo was fired, and in an instant, her chance for a different future seemed to vanish. The situation at home grew worse, and her relationship with her father became increasingly strained. After a severe argument and beating over the loss of her job, Toni Jo left home, deciding she'd survive on her own terms. It was during these years that Toni Jo took on a new name and identity, distancing herself from her past as Annie Beatrice. She began a hard life on the streets, turning to hustling and eventually finding work in Shreveport's red light district. Though she survived, life on the streets came at a heavy cost. Toni Jo fell into a deepening spiral of addiction, using drugs to blunt the pain and hopelessness that surrounded her. To many, she was just another lost girl in a rough city, but Toni Jo's story was far from over. By her early 20s, she had moved through Louisiana and parts of South Texas, taking jobs wherever she could find them, searching for a stability that always seemed just out of reach. Yet, despite the struggles and setbacks, Toni Jo's fierce determination remained, along with the hope that somewhere along the way, life might still change for the better. Then, one day in 1939, that hope took the shape of Claude "Cowboy" Henry, a down-on-his-luck prizefighter she met while working in Austin. Claude, with his charm and rugged looks, saw something in her that others had overlooked, and the two fell hard and fast for each other. Married soon after, Toni Jo and Claude's happiness was brief, as Claude was arrested shortly after their return to Louisiana. Accused of murder and sentenced to 50 years in the Texas State Penitentiary, Claude's imprisonment left Toni Jo devastated and determined. Faced with a life without the man she loved, Toni Jo made a decision. She would get Claude out of prison, no matter what it took. But how far would Toni Jo go to free the man she loved? Determined to free her husband from a 50-year prison sentence, Toni Jo Henry was willing to risk everything. Her love for Claude had pushed her to desperation, and she was willing to cross any line to reunite with him. To make the plan a reality, Toni Jo enlisted the help of Harold "Archie" Burks, an ex-con and Army deserter with a rough past and knowledge of prison layouts. Together, they crafted a daring scheme. They would rob a bank to fund their escape, secure weapons, and set off across Louisiana. But they quickly needed a vehicle, and fate brought them into contact with Joseph Calloway, a traveling salesman who stopped to give them a ride, unaware of what was to come. As they rode along the winding Louisiana roads, Toni Jo saw an opportunity in Calloway's vehicle and the money he carried. Under the guise of friendliness, she and Archie asked Calloway to pull over onto a secluded country road. As they drove past Jennings, Louisiana, Toni, Joe, and Archie robbed Calloway at gunpoint. They proceeded to lock him in the trunk of his car and drive down a country road. The duo planned to use the Ford as a getaway vehicle. However, they soon decided to pull the car over on a country track. Calloway was ordered out of the car. He was then ushered into a field and told to strip as Henry wanted a change of clothes for her husband when they broke him out of prison. Calloway was then shot once in the head with a .32 caliber revolver and died at the scene. Toni Joe's mind was focused on one goal: to free her husband from the Texas prison, and every decision she made was for that purpose. But the gravity of their actions would soon catch up with her. Taking the car, Toni, Joe, and Archie drove toward Arkansas, but tensions quickly rose between the two. Archie, realizing just how far Toni Joe was willing to go, grew increasingly uneasy. Somewhere along the road, he decided he wanted no part in what lay ahead, abandoning Toni Joe at a stop and taking the vehicle with him. Left alone and without a plan, Toni Joe made her way back to Shreveport by bus, desperate and emotionally drained. She sought refuge with her aunt, who offered her a moment of safety in a chaotic time. But the burden of her actions began to weigh heavily, and Toni Joe confessed what had happened, revealing to her family where Calloway's belongings could be found. Her confession set off a chain of events that would soon captivate the nation. When law enforcement arrived, Toni Joe was taken into custody, and details of the crime made headlines across Louisiana. The shocking tale of a young woman turned outlaw, willing to risk everything for love, seized the public's imagination. Toni Joe's striking looks and tragic story added fuel to the media firestorm that surrounded her, and questions lingered in the minds of many. Was she a desperate woman driven by love, or a cold-blooded criminal? But as her trial approached, would her charm sway the courtroom, or would the weight of her crime bring her to justice? With her confession to the murder of Joseph Calloway, Toni Joe Henry was thrust into the public spotlight, and Louisiana had a new obsession. The young woman from Shreveport, captivating and fiercely loyal to her husband, was now facing the consequences of a crime that had shaken the quiet roads of rural Louisiana. Toni Joe's beauty and charm set her apart from other accused criminals, and soon the press latched onto every detail of her life and crime, branding her story as one of love, betrayal, and shocking violence. But despite her soft-spoken manner and claims of desperation, the reality of Calloway's murder was clear, and a swift legal battle began. The first trial, held in Lake Charles, Louisiana, drew crowds from across the state. Journalists scrambled for seats in the packed courtroom, eager to capture every glance, gesture, and word of the young woman who stood accused of murder. Toni Joe sat in the defendant's chair, calm and collected, and her striking appearance, carefully curled hair, and composed expression had an undeniable effect on those in attendance. She claimed Archie Burks had fired the fatal shot, insisting that she had simply been swept up in a scheme that spiraled out of control. But the jury was not swayed, and after 6 hours of deliberation, they convicted Toni Joe of murder, sentencing her to death. Despite the verdict, Toni Joe's legal battle was far from over. Her defense team filed an appeal, citing the intense media coverage as grounds for a retrial. They argued that the sensational press had swayed public opinion against her, painting her as a femme fatale rather than a woman acting out of love and desperation. The appeal was granted, and in February 1941, Toni Joe stood trial once again. This time, Archie Burks was called to testify against her. His testimony painted a damning picture of Toni Joe as the mastermind behind the murder, claiming that she had been the one to pull the trigger. The jury took only an hour to convict her once again, delivering the same sentence, death by electrocution. But Toni Joe's fight continued. Her defense filed another appeal, and for a third time she faced trial in January 1942. By this point, Toni Joe had become a figure of national infamy. her story appearing in newspapers and magazines across the country. Some readers were sympathetic, viewing her as a woman undone by love. Others saw her as a cold-blooded killer, masked by a pretty face. In this third trial, Toni Jo's demeanor was noticeably more subdued. She seemed to understand that her options were running out, and that the reality of the electric chair was closing in. The jury delivered its final verdict swiftly, finding her guilty once more and upholding the death sentence. This time, there would be no appeal to save her. Desperate, Toni Jo's defense team submitted a final plea for clemency to Louisiana Governor Sam H. Jones, hoping to spare her life on humanitarian grounds. But the governor refused to intervene, convinced that justice must be served. As her execution date loomed, the public's fascination with Toni Jo only grew. Some sympathized with the young woman, seeing her as a tragic figure led astray by love, while others viewed her as an emblem of the risks posed by crime and desperation. By now, Toni Jo had been in jail for over 2 years, awaiting her fate. She spent her final months forming an unexpected friendship with Father Wayne Richard, a local Catholic priest who visited her frequently. Father Richard saw beyond her notoriety, viewing her as a young woman struggling with remorse. Over time, he became her confidant, guiding her through moments of despair and eventually baptizing her in preparation for her final day. Toni Jo, now accepting the gravity of her actions, leaned on her newfound faith as a source of solace, determined to face her end with dignity. But as the date of her execution drew closer, Toni Jo's resolve was tested as never before. Would she face the electric chair bravely, or would the weight of her choices break her spirit? As Toni Jo Henry's execution date drew near, the atmosphere around her story shifted. Once a media sensation, the young woman from Shreveport was now awaiting her final moments in Lake Charles Prison. The reality of her sentence hung heavy in the air, and the public's fascination with her life had taken on a somber tone. Louisiana's first female death row inmate, Toni Jo's case had made history, and her impending execution was both anticipated and dreaded. Inside the prison, she spent her days preparing for the inevitable, accompanied by Father Wayne Richard, a local priest who had become her spiritual guide and only true confidant. Father Richard had come to know Toni Jo in a way few others had. He was moved by her story, her expressions of regret, and her steady acceptance of her fate. With his guidance, Toni Jo sought redemption in her final days, relying on her newfound faith to help her face what lay ahead. Through their conversations, she began to accept the reality of her choices, and her once fierce demeanor softened. As news spread of her spiritual transformation, some viewed it as a sign of genuine remorse, while others dismissed it as a final bid for sympathy. 4 days before her execution date, Toni Jo's story took one last dramatic twist. News broke that her husband, Claude Cowboy Henry, had escaped from the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville, determined to see his wife one final time. It was a desperate act, fueled by his undying loyalty and their tragic love story. The authorities immediately launched a manhunt tracking him across state lines. His escape was brief. Within days, he was apprehended in Beaumont, Texas, and his plan to reunite with Toni Jo fell apart. Still, his attempt only intensified the public's perception of their doomed romance, framing their story as a bittersweet tale of love turned tragic. On the day of her execution, November 28, 1942, Toni Jo remained calm, her faith now guiding her through her final moments. As she was led to the basement of the Calcasieu Parish Courthouse, where Louisiana's portable electric chair awaited, witnesses reported her quiet composure. Father Richard stood by her side, offering words of comfort, while prison officials prepared for the somber procedure. It was a historic moment. Toni Jo Henry was about to become the first and only woman to die by electric chair in the state of Louisiana. The room was silent as the final preparations were made, and with the last prayer from Father Richard, Toni Jo took her seat. The execution was swift. Father Richard would later describe Toni Jo's final moments as peaceful, her expression marked by a sense of acceptance. Her story, however, left an indelible mark on Louisiana's history. In the days following, newspaper headlines reflected on her life, her crime, and the extraordinary events that led her to the electric chair. The public was left with questions that lingered long after her death. Was she a victim of circumstance, a woman led astray by love, or a calculated criminal who paid the ultimate price? The tale of Toni Jo Henry continued to haunt Louisiana, her tragic story retold in books and films that cast her as both a figure of sympathy and caution. And while the years would add layers of legend to her life, the memory of Toni Jo remained vivid, a reminder of the thin line between desperation and destruction. But her story isn't just about crime, it's about the human capacity for love, regret, and ultimately redemption. The execution of Toni Jo Henry left a lasting imprint on Louisiana, casting a shadow that would remain part of the state's lore. As the only woman ever executed in Louisiana's electric chair, Toni Jo's case was unprecedented, and the circumstances surrounding her life and crime continued to fascinate the public. In the days following her death, newspapers across the state revisited her story, recounting the crime, her trials, and her transformation in her final days. Some were sympathetic, portraying her as a tragic figure led astray by love. Others saw her as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how desperation and crime could lead to irreversible consequences. The tale of Toni Jo's doomed romance with Claude "Cowboy" Henry fueled much of the public's fascination. Their relationship was viewed by some as a Southern Gothic tragedy, a story of love that spiraled into violence. Many were captivated by Claude's escape attempt just days before her execution, seeing it as a testament to their undying loyalty to each other, even as their choices had brought them to a tragic end. Her case sparked discussions about justice and redemption, and Toni Jo's relationship with Father Wayne Richard added an unexpected dimension, as his accounts of her repentance provided a glimpse into her final thoughts. Over time, Toni Jo Henry's story became embedded in Louisiana's criminal history, inspiring books, films, and even local folklore. To some, she became a symbol of a woman who had been shaped by harsh circumstances, whose love and desperation had driven her to a fatal choice. To others, she represented the darker side of human nature, an example of how love and loyalty can twist into something destructive. But no matter how her story was interpreted, Toni Jo remained a complex figure, both villain and victim, in the eyes of a fascinated public. The legacy of Toni Jo Henry lingers, reminding us of the complicated line between love and desperation, and the far-reaching consequences of choices made in the heat of passion. Her story still haunts Louisiana, a tale of beauty and tragedy that asks questions with no easy answers, leaving her memory both infamous and unforgettable. And so, Toni Jo Henry's story becomes more than a crime. It's a reflection on how lives can veer into darkness, and how sometimes history holds on to those stories, leaving them forever in the shadows.